Hello and welcome to Tech Latest by Nikkei Asia, where we bring you the freshest updates from the technology sector in Asia. From Nikkei Asia's Tokyo headquarters, I'm Alice French. In this episode, my colleague Jada Nagumo is catching up with Cissy Zhou in Hong Kong about China's budding flying car industry.
Hi, Cissy. Thank you so much for hopping on this week's Tech Latest podcast.
Hi, Jada.
So today I wanted to get your thoughts on the recent developments happening in China's flying car sector, or as some call it, the low-altitude economy. We're seeing a lot of interesting startups expand their services, but what caught my eye was an announcement by the city of Guangzhou, which you wrote about, right?
Yes. Guangzhou is a kind of very interesting city. It is a capital city of Guangdong province, and along with Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, it's one of China's 4 tier 1 cities. But it's actually lagging behind, the other 3 in a lot of ways. And in the past few years, there were also doubts about the city's economic status, actually. Guangzhou has been traditionally relying on fossil fuel vehicles and the property market for growth, but both of the sectors are not doing well today in China, right? As China is undergoing a property crisis and Beijing is aggressively supporting the EV sector, I think Guangzhou is trying to find some other channels for future growth, such as the low-altitude sector, which is not really in shape yet. So last week, the city announced to invest $1.4 billion in flying car infrastructure in the city. And that move was following the central government's plan to develop the so-called low-altitude economy. Moreover, Guangzhou is actually not the first city to roll out red carpets for flying cars. Late last year, the Shenzhen municipal government, also a city in Guangdong province, but with much higher GDP growth than Guangzhou, announced that any qualified eVTOL company setting up its headquarters in Shenzhen will be rewarded with up to $2.8 billion.
I see. I mean, that seems like a lot of money, 1.4 billion by 2027. Who are actually sort of the main players currently making their mark in this sector in terms of like startups and companies? Which one should we keep an eye on? And also, what is the competition like? Is it just getting started, or would you say it's already pretty intense?
I think part of the reason for Guangzhou to make such an announcement is that the city is the headquarters of 2 of the leading flying vehicle manufacturers, Yihang and XPeng Aero HT, or XPeng Aero Huitian in Chinese. That is a subsidiary of Chinese EV maker XPeng. And Yihang is one of China's earliest air taxi maker, and it has been listed in Nasdaq. So it's currently absolutely leading in this sector because it is the only company in this sector that has gained 3 certificates that mainly paved the way for commercial operations. But for full commercial operation, Yihang still needs an so-called air operator certificate from regulators. So far, there's no framework in place for this kind of certificate because this sector is so new and it's still quickly evolving. So Yihang is working with regulators on standardization. For XPeng, it's quite lagging if you compare it to Yihang because XPeng so far has not gained any certificate for either safety approval or mass production. And the authorities have accepted its application for type certificate in March. Type certificate means the approval of the design and or its component parts of aircraft. And the company's vice president told me that they expect they will get the type certificate in around 12 to 18 months. Besides Yihang and XPeng, there are other flying car makers in China in other regions, such as Autoflight and TCAP Tech in Shanghai, and Aero Future in Chengdu, which is a subsidiary of Chinese automaker Geely. And I do expect, as local governments pulling more money in supporting this sector, maybe there were more companies joining this race. And at this stage, those flying car makers are all aiming for the businesses and, for example, air taxi and air tourism services instead of individual users, because the flying car is quite expensive. The starting price for one flying car is expected to be over 14,000 US dollars.
I see. It seems like regulation, certification are very important parts of this, and competition is probably going to start heating up very soon. China seems to have big hopes for its low altitude industry, as you mentioned, and is willing to, support it. This is while the country's overall economic growth continues to be sluggish, as you mentioned, the property market woes as well. But does this low altitude sector have the potential to become a new growth driver for China? What do you think?
Yes, this sector is really an emerging industry, and a lot of regulations are not in place yet. There are also flying car makers in the US, right? And China is trying to lead in rural settings in this sector, just exactly like what it did in the 5G sector. So from a geopolitical perspective, it wants to lead. But for China itself, as you mentioned, China's economy is really struggling after the ongoing property crisis, and it's been shifting towards EV for growth. But the EV sector is predicted to peak in 2030. So it needs a sector for new growth for after 2030. And some Chinese officials are saying, it should be the low altitude sector. And given China has a strong base for this industry, because China's drone industry is quite dominant, as it has companies such as DJI. And then early this year, China included the low altitude economy in the government report for the first time. In China, airspace is traditionally overseen by the Air Force. And there's a long-standing notion anything above the 3 meters belong to the military. But what we are seeing now is a gradual losing of restrictions on this sector, because the military has to compromise a bit in exchange for economic growth.
I see. Well, you mentioned the EV market peaking in 2030, but as of now, a lot of Chinese auto companies are, accelerating their overseas expansion and are increasing their EV offerings, which has also led to a pretty intense price war. But how do you think the emergence of the flying cars will impact China's EV industry overall in, positive or negatively?
It is a great and very important question. Actually, those two industries are interconnected, I think. First of all, just like the EV sector, China wants to pass on the curve, literally 弯道超车 in Chinese, in the flying car industry too. Because the Chinese government thinks this sector has vast commercial potential in the future. And the past year alone, the market scale of the low altitude economy, which includes a drone business in China, exceeded 69 billion US dollars. And if you look at the traditional aircraft industry, the engines and the key auto parts, they are all manufactured and dominated by the US and Europe. And China has been really struggling in that perspective. But for the flying cars, it's sort of different because it relies on battery. And China has advantages in batteries. So it hopes to dominate this sector, just like EV does, by leveraging its green technology. But currently, there are still some hurdles, as flying cars need specific batteries, which means high in density. So some of the flying car makers, they are actually working together with battery manufacturers such as TL on this front. And we all know that BYD, is the leading EV maker in China, and that company is also very strong in battery making. So maybe they would enter the race in a few years too. We don't know. Let's wait and see.
Well, thank you so much, Cissy, for that rundown and sharing your thoughts. We really hope we can have you back on again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jada.
That's all for this episode. You can read more of Cissy's reporting, along with a host of other stories about Asia's tech industry, on Nikkei Asia's website, asia.nikkei.com. And if you like what you hear, why not subscribe to our weekly Tech Asia newsletter, which will be delivered to your inbox every Thursday. There's a link to sign up in the show notes. And whilst we still have you, if you're enjoying Tech Latest and would like to support us, please do give us a follow on whichever podcast platform you use. We also really appreciate any reviews you can leave, as these help new listeners to find our episodes. Thank you for listening, and check back in next time for more updates on the tech trends that matter.